All right, welcome to another episode of the Scripting Them podcast. I'm Fernando, and in today's episode, I want to cover the topic of open source. Essentially, to focus more on open source licenses, but I also want to kind of clear the air on what open source is meant to be, and also kind of one of the biggest misconceptions around open source. So let's get started. So the first thing to talk about is what exactly is open source, or open source software, if you will, OSS. So open source software is essentially software that has its code freely open for others to read, potentially modify and distribute to others for free, essentially. You can look at the code of an open source project and understand how it works. Even in some situations, and we're gonna get more into that in a minute, you can even change it or adapt it to suit your specific needs and then distribute it yourself, either with the same name, with a different name, or even under a paid license. But over the years, open source has evolved to be more than that, to be more than just having your product's code open to the world. Open source right now is a movement that is really more about community, creating communities around projects, around technologies, and kind of fostering collaboration and fostering innovation. To be honest, I'm yet to see, and I'm not saying there isn't, I'm just saying that I'm yet to see another industry other than IT that has such a movement. Because if you think about it, the amount of hours that open source contributors put in for free so that a specific piece of software, be it a library, a framework, even a full product, can grow and work properly and without bugs, or even have proper documentation. I mean, the amount of work that these contributors put in, it's just unheard of. Where in what other industry do you see people with similar interests and similar skill sets contributing so openly instead of sort of fighting and competing with each other? So that is kind of the core of the open source movement, essentially, that has been blowing my mind over the years, and it continues to do so, because the entire software industry depends on tons of open source projects that are freely available. Mind you, licenses in the middle, but most of it is fully available, and the way that project grows in many cases is through free contributions from either one-off contributors or regular contributors that are always there looking to improve that piece of software, that piece of library. So it's really, really interesting. Mind you, over the years, there have been attempts at solving the fact that these people are working for free, essentially. And many companies have tried to different approaches. I think that there are ways now to give, to willingly provide some contributions, monetary or otherwise, to the contributors. You can sponsor them through GitHub sponsors. You can buy them quote unquote coffees and provide some donations. There are ways in which you can provide some help or compensation for their work, but it's really fully it's something that it's not mandatory. It's something that if you have the will to do it, you can do it, but not many people do it. I mean, I don't know how many people can say that they actually live off of their earnings solely on their open source projects. It's a field that it still has a lot more to grow in that regard, in my opinion. But that's aside from this episode. I don't want to get into that particular topic today. It's definitely worth a full episode on that. Today, what I want to get into more specifically is the type of licenses there are around open source. Because again, going back to the definition, open source ideally is software that has their code open to the world, and then it can be modified, it can be changed, and it can be redistributed. But not every piece of open source is the same, and not every piece of code can be changed and redistributed legally. So let's look into some of the main open source licenses that are out there and what they exactly mean for developers, either owning these projects or contributors, or even people looking to get these projects and use them in other places like commercial products. Now, before we get into the licenses, there is one big misconception around open source that I want to cover in regards to the licenses. Actually, some developers tend to think that open source software is free, 100% free. You can do whatever you want. It's open, it's out there, and there is no one really stopping me from using that code, stealing it, quote unquote, stealing it, if you will, and then just using it for my own benefit, and even charging other people and forgetting about it. Now, yes, there are licenses that allow you to do that. We'll look into a few in a minute, but that is not intrinsically true. Just because a piece of code is open source, it doesn't mean it's freely available for you to use however you want. There are some licenses that are restrictions in different ways, and you have to comply with those licenses. So the first thing that you have to do when you find an open source project that you want to use is look at the repo. Ideally, there is a file called license.txt. Inside it, you'll find the actual license for the code. Read it, go through it, make sure you understand which license you're looking at and the restrictions apply to you as a user or as a consumer of that code. If you do not follow or comply with the clauses of that license, there could be legal implications for your project. I am no lawyer. This is not a legal podcast. This is a software development one. But just know that the risk is there. And if you're just not paying attention to the licenses, you're just running legal risks for no reason. Just know that just because one of these projects is somehow limited in the way you can use it, it doesn't mean that you can't use it for your own, even make money off of it. Just make sure you understand the limitations and think about if complying to them allows you to still remain profitable, and if you want to secure your code, if the license allows you to do that. This is just an FYI, essentially. Open source doesn't equal completely free. Just remember that. Now let's go into the licenses. All right, so the first open source license I want to cover, it's a very known one, is GPL, or GNU General Public License, essentially. So, again, I'm gonna cover this at a very high level, kind of summarizing very much everything that entails the license. You can go and read more details about each one individually. If one specifically kind of sounds familiar, sounds like this is what you would want for your project, then deep dive on that one. But make sure this is a very important topic when it comes to developing open source software, because type of license that you pick for your project will determine how others can use it. So if your intention is to just distribute something that is completely free and anyone can do whatever they want with the code, that's fantastic. Just go with one specific license. But what you're building, you want to protect it, and you want to make sure that people can't modify it, or if they modify it, they have to let you know, or even if they modify it, they have to also make it available as well for free for others. Then there are other licenses that tackle those that legal side, let's put it that way. So this is crucial. This is something that every open source project should have a license, and the right one. So again, let's go with GPL first. GPL essentially says that everyone has access to your code, and everyone is permitted to change it however they want. That said, the changes that they make to your code need to remain under the exact same license. So whatever they change, whatever they add, also has to be freely available to others and under the GPL license as well. So this is kind of to protect the core of the open source movement, meaning it's to protect or to foster an open collaborative environment, an open development environment. Whatever you can distribute your library, your framework, your product, and if someone under this license, and if someone else wants to add to it and call it something else, they absolutely can, but it has to remain open as well. They can't just copy your code, make changes to it, and then sell it and as a closed source solution. That's not possible under GPL. Some known projects under this license are the GCC C compiler. This is one that if you ever done any C, any C++, you probably used. The Linux kernel, essentially, the core of the Linux OS, is under the GPL license. And also a very popular CMS, the WordPress CMS, the open source version, is under GPL. So these are projects that you can look up and they will have the GPL license, meaning that you can look at their code, you can expand that code, add to it, but it has to remain free and open to everyone. So the second license that we're going to cover is the MIT license. This is also a very known one, especially because if you really don't know much about open source or open source licenses, and you just want everyone to be able to use your code freely, then you just slap the MIT license there and forget about it. And that's kind of the reason for this license. This license essentially allows anyone to do whatever they want with your code. They can use it, they can expand it, they can import it into the project and close it. It's really very permissive. This in turn encourages kind of wide adoption of your project, of your code, because it's non-restrictive essentially. People can do whatever they want with your code. That also has a negative, quote unquote, negative impact of not ensuring that any improvement to your code is also freely available. People can, if your project is under MIT license, people can just come in, improve your code or your algorithms or whatever, and close it and sell it as a full product, and that's completely legal. There is nothing preventing them from doing that. It doesn't mean that it's a bad license, and it doesn't mean that doing that is evil or bad or whatever. These are just the rules of the game. If you open something through the MIT license, that is what you're essentially letting people or telling people they can do. By the way, some very known open source projects under the MIT license are the jQuery library, for example. You might not be aware of it because it's been around for quite a while. But if you've been around for 10, 20 years like me, you probably used jQuery, or heck, maybe there's people using it still, and that is under the MIT license. So you can do whatever you want with this library. Same goes for Ruby on Rails. Actually, according to my research, Ruby on Rails, the framework, is also under the MIT license. And finally, a library called XPath. That is another one that is an XML parser for C. It's a library for C, and that is also under the MIT license. So you can grab that code, change it, add it to your project completely for free and completely legally. Now, the third license that I want to cover is the Apache license. That is also, if you've been in using open source software, it doesn't mean you don't have to be an open source contributor or developer, but if you've been using open source software, you probably heard of some sort of a product that starts with the name Apache something. That means that the product is under the Apache license. What that means is that the code is open source, and that if you were to change something in that code, you'd perfectly be able to do it, but you have to document the changes that you make, and you have to attribute in that documentation, that publicly available documentation, you have to attribute copyrights to the original code, to the original entity that created the project. So it's not exactly like the MIT license where you can just grab it, do whatever you want, and forget about everything else. This license, the Apache license, also allows you to even import it into a closed source project, and whatever extra you add, it doesn't have to be open source. So in that regard, it's kind of the same, but whatever you add, you have to document it though. You have to make sure that you document the extract or the changes that you make to the original code, and you have to give proper copyright to the original source code, to the original project, to make sure that you can trace back from your project to whatever open source project you used. There has to be a kind of a direct line of sight to that project. That's kind of the overall Apache, the overall gist of the Apache license. It is known for like the Apache HTTP server. If you're in the data or big data world, Apache Hadoop, Apache Cassandra. I mean, the big data ecosystem is filled with Apache licensed products. But it's really, I would say that it's probably one of the most popular ones at this point, at least from what I've seen, especially in the world of data. All right. So the fourth license that we're going to cover here is called BSD license, or Berkeley's Software Distribution License. So this is again very open. It allows you to change, to like read, change, modify, or use mostly however you want the code of a BSD license software. You can even use it like the MIT license. You can even use it inside your own closed source project. So it kind of limits the access to innovation, to changes that are being done on the original software. Now, it's meant to be very simple to understand and very simple to comply with. So if you're looking for something that is not intricate, because these licenses tend to be very intricate to read and understand, the BSD license is very simple to follow and to apply with. Now there are two variations: the FreeBSD, the one that is called FreeBSD, or also simplified BSD. It kind of fulfills these points I've been telling you. And then there's the three clauses BSD, which also adds a non-endorsement clause, which means essentially that if you're using a product, an open source software that is under this three clause BSD license, you cannot use the name of the project or the name of its contributors to promote your own product without a written endorsement letter, essentially, without them giving you actual permission specifically to do that. And that is kind of an interesting twist on this, because so far we haven't really talked about that, but you can definitely, as a marketing strategy, you can definitely openly say that your software is based on some other very well-known open source software. Maybe your library, maybe even your product is based off a very well-known, freely available software that so-and-so have contributed or even created. This specific license prevents that kind of marketing stunt, which I think it's a great extra clause to add to whatever license you have, because that protects the original project, and it protects the original project's contributors from indirectly endorsing something that is created off of their work, without them having any control over it. So that is a very thoughtful and ethically aware clause. So this is a license that I really like. Right now, the fifth license that I want to cover is called the Mozilla Public License, essentially MPL. This was created by the Mozilla organization, and obviously the Mozilla Firefox product is under MPL. Now, this is an interesting license because everything we've talked about so far allows you to modify the entirety of the open source project and either add it to your project and close it if you want to, or at least provide some sort of like traceability back to the original open source project, but you can still like own it and close it. Now, the MPL is kind of a middle ground. It allows you to add and change whatever you want on a MPL project, but with the restriction of saying that whatever extra files you add to the project, you can definitely close them if you want to. But if you change anything in the existing files of the project, those changes have to remain open. So if you're changing something, sort of an algorithm that is already there, part of a file in the project, there is no way around it. You have to make those changes public. If you add extra things, some proprietary code, something that you don't really want people or competitors to know about, to be able to read, then those, as long as you put that code in your own files, in new files, then that's completely fine. You can close that part of the project, but the original MPL project has to remain, and those files have to remain open no matter what changes you make to them. Now, again, this is an interesting middle ground, and because of that, it kind of makes it really hard for companies to adopt it, because they have to comply. It's a very like fine line of, you have to really plan how you add the code and how you modify that project so that it can, your final project can comply with the license. Now, if you're looking at a big product that is composed of 1, 2, or maybe a few small MPL based projects that you're not really planning on modifying, just using, that's fantastic. You can absolutely do it. However, if your project is directly based off of a big MPL based project and you want to add things to it, then the logistics of adding code to it and growing it kind of become a little bit more complex. That's all. Now, that's it. Those are essentially the main licenses I wanted to cover. There are others, and in the show notes I will link to a website that allows you to summarize these licenses in a way that they're understandable, especially by developers. These licenses, most of them are meant for lawyers. So this episode that doesn't really cover legal advice. This is my understanding of these licenses, for you to be aware that there are many different ones and that you should be looking into them if you have an open source project, to make sure that whoever is using them, they're doing it however you feel comfortable. Or if you're using open source software in your project, you're paying attention to the type of license. Because if you have commercial product that uses open source software as part of it, and you're not complying to these licenses, you might eventually run into legal problems. So this is a real issue that you have to at least take care of. Make sure that you're aware of this. And if you are, it shouldn't be that difficult. There are companies that are created around open source projects. So this is absolutely valid, and this is absolutely possible to do and to earn money off of these projects, and in a completely ethical and legal way. You just have to make sure that however whatever you use, it's properly documented and you comply with these licenses. That's all. So to summarize, open source is amazing. Open source is a great movement. If you've for some reason haven't really used any open source software so far and been spending tons of money, or working for companies that spend tons of money on closed source projects, that is completely fine. But just give open source a try. This is not a world filled with bugs or unmaintained projects. There are definitely a ton of those, but ton of these big open source projects actually are owned by companies that provide paid maintenance and support as well. So definitely something that you want to look into, because open source is mostly community maintained, community driven. So the IT industry itself is guiding how these projects grow. So what better way to trust them if that's not it? Now, in terms of licenses, remember GPL, fantastic to allow anyone to use it as long and change it as long as whatever gets changed is also under the same license. The MIT license, wonderful if you don't really care what people do with your code, and amazing if you find a project under that license that you need to use, you can freely use it. The Apache license, kind of more restrictive, but also it's the one that several of the biggest projects in the industry are under. So it's something to look into if you want this, if you want your open source code and your open source project to remain secure while still growing. The BSD license, especially the 3-closed version of it, it's very protective and permissive at the same time. So essentially it allows people to use your code, but without them taking advantage of your name or the project, the name of the project, or even the name of your contributors, without them giving explicit permission. So definitely look into that one if you want people to do whatever they want with your code, but just protecting names. The MPL license, the Mozilla one, they're still permissive with caution. Allows you to add closed code to the project while keeping whatever modifications you make to the original files open. Remember, there are many options. Check out the link in the description if you want more, if none of these fits your specific use case, but pay attention to whatever licenses you're interacting with, either in your own projects or with the project that you use. That's at least the advice I want you to get out of this episode. And that's it. I hope you found the episode interesting and informative. If you have, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel if you're watching this on YouTube, or just make sure that you subscribe to the podcast on whatever podcast application you're using. I try to provide weekly advice to developers in as many different topics as we need to interact with. So our profession is not just about coding, it's about a lot of other things. So I just hope you're finding some value out of this episode. If you are, reach out. There are many ways in which you can reach out. Links are in the show notes. So I would love to know what you think about the episode. And if you have any ideas for future episodes, if there are any topics that you'd like me to talk about or expand on, just let me know. I'll be happy to. All right. See you on the next one. And that was it for this episode of the Scripting Them podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Remember that you can find me online on Twitter at DeliteMan123. And you can also find the podcast YouTube channel just searching for the Scripting Them on YouTube. Thank you again, and catch you on the next one.